Good evening. In this edition of History Today, we'll be considering the career of Ruth Williams. With me, I have three people who shared many of the most significant moments in Ruth's career. On my left, I have Jill Hall, who worked with Ruth for many years in the School of Health Studies CPD department. Further to my left, I have Colin Eastwood, who spent much of his career sharing an office with Ruth. On my right, my third guest is James Brown, who for much of his career, he spent the time hiding away from Ruth. So let's start with you first, Jill. The work ethic of Mrs. Williams is almost legendary. Can you give us any stories that might illustrate the extent to which she is a hard worker?
Well, Chris, thank you. I'm glad you've raised that. Yes, I remember working with Ruth on many occasions, and obviously she's very hard-working, very motivated, and she has very exacting standards.
Stickler for detail?
Oh, absolutely. One particular occasion I seem to remember was Boxing Day 2004. We'd been given the task of actually setting the budget for CPD. Obviously, Ruth, being the brains behind it, had the actual calculator, and I was there doing the scribing. We started around about 10 o'clock in the morning and went throughout the day.
So, just so I've got this right, she was the Ebenezer Scrooge to your Bob Cratchit.
Well, I perhaps wouldn't quite say that, but she was very keen to get the budget sorted. Around about lunchtime, I suggested that we stop for a bite to eat, but of course Ruth wanted to carry on. Around about 3 o'clock, I started to suggest that perhaps we should call it a day. It was, after all, Boxing Day, but Ruth decided to carry on. Around about sort of 4:30, I had really about had enough. She wasn't really taking that much notice of me, so I decided that the only thing I could do was take some action. I actually picked up all of the papers, threw them into the air in disgust, sat back and said, right, that's it, I'm not doing any more. Ruth, as you can imagine, looked at me with one of her looks, said, now you can pick those all up, which I proceeded to do, and we then worked on for another hour and a half, finishing around about 6 o'clock.
Did you ring the police at any stage? That sounds like being kidnapped. Colin, you shared an office with Ruth for many, many years. Exacting?
Yes, it was actually. In fact, my first memories of Ruth was when she was being orientated as to her appointment as a tutor to the continuing education team. And she came across to spend some time with the chief nursing advisor, Miss Alice McNaughton. And I was Alice McNaughton's staff officer. And she came into my office just for a few moments, and my wall at that time was plastered, literally plastered, with graphs of sickness and absence of the various grades of staff in the various hospitals. And then in 1st of February 1989, I was appointed a tutor to the continuing education department, and shared an office with Ruth at the old new site of the School of Health Studies. And then later that year, we moved across to the old site, and once again, we shared an office together.
Jim, you spent much of your career, as I said in the introduction, trying to avoid the gaze of Mrs. Williams. I remember we shared an office up in Malton Hospital, which had the advantage of nobody ever knowing quite where you were or what you were doing. Is that correct?
Yes.
Well, thanks for that, Jim. Now, Colin, to come back to you. I always found that Mrs. Williams was very helpful, very unjudging, and no matter what problem that you went with her to, she always had some solid advice for you. And I found her a very sort of humane colleague to work with.
With her experience, yes, she always had something to come back on and to give advice where necessary. I can always remember also, we used to have staff meetings, if you remember in those days, in each other's houses. And once we went to Ruth's home for a staff meeting.
Well, I can't beat sandwich.
I used to have those for lunch, James, when I was working, but I've been retired 10 years, so I've now gone on to something different, thank you. We would start at 9 o'clock, and whereby other tutors would probably finish a little early, We went straight through till 4:30 and 4:45.
A little early. I think that he's driving at you there, Jim.
I take offence at that.
Really, Mr.
I never
Brown?
went missing. I may have gone, if I said I was going to the tower block, I would go to the tower block. I may leave through the front door, but I used to go to the tower block.
Via Formby bypass. And you'd say in the middle of summer, Colin, I'm going now, it's 5 to 4, there's snow on the Formby bypass.
Yes, I never told you a lie. And the next day, it was flooded because it was a thawed.
And what was going on, Jim, all those years when you were going clinical, as you used to put it?
I used to go clinical. I used to go over to the departments, see that everything was working well, and leave. That would be about 4:30. However, when I went at 4, I was in at 8 in the morning.
8 to 5, Monday to Friday.
Monday to Friday. That was my work ethic.
So, Jill, I've always found that Mrs. Williams is always helpful in people's careers. She always wants to see people get on and do their best. Have you any personal experiences of how she helped you on in your career?
Absolutely. Ruth and I were both obviously applying for jobs as assheads within the organisation.
Assheads?
Assistant heads of CPD. And Ruth and I spent many an hour working through all the policies and the procedures. She was instrumental in me actually getting my post, and I can only thank her for that, because obviously it's been a big boost to my career.
Where do you think that the woman gets the patience from to go through these policy documents, which, let's face it, they're not Harry Potter? She can go through these documents, and she seems to eat it up as though it's exciting material, when you and I know that this stuff is pretty dull.
Well, I think actually Ruth does find it quite exciting, but then she's the kind of person that would write policies and procedures and find them extremely interesting and rewarding.
Did you ever find that if you wrote something for her, that she would correct it and then send it back to you?
Can I interdigitate here? Because many times in my professional life, I went to Ruth for advice on working documents, my essays, my diplomas and other academic qualification requirements. She would even tell you the full stop was in the wrong place. And I learned not to go to Ruth in the end. I went to Jackie Hitchin, and that was worse.
There must have come a point at some stage. I think she learned all this off Earless, you see, that's the point. Because there always came a point with documents where you'd find that the corrections would be correcting the corrections, if you get me drift. But,
I was going to say, in the early days, we all worked for Mrs. Trudy Hodge, who was...
Now, she was a lady.
Who was a wonderful lady, really.
Wonderful.
And I can always remember also when the day I went to Ruth, the only time in the years I worked with her where she became literally emotional, and that was the occasion when I went to her to say I was thinking about taking retirement. And she swelled up and tears came into her eyes.
No.
And said, Colin.
Thank goodness for that.
At last.
Are you sure you counted the chairs right?
Well, it used to be, well, not my job, but I used to do it to try and keep things in order, didn't I?
You did. And what did she say to you when she filled up?
She said, well, if this is what you want, Colin, go and see Mrs. Chin. So I made an appointment to go and see Mrs. Chin. And I retired 10 years ago on the 31st of October this year.
You're a walking almanac.
Well, I even knew the day that that Chris started on the 1st of December.
Yes,
1989.
Yeah.
The other thing is that we've all known. I've been saying this to innumerable people. We've all known many generations of Ruth's family.
We have.
You know,
Yes.
I've interviewed Ruth's mum for a course that I'm doing, and we all knew Vicky.
We did.
Yes,
You know,
that's all, yeah.
and Vicky's now working in the operating theatres of Aintree Trust.
And the grandson Michael being born.
On that, I'd like to draw this discussion to a close. So to all my guests tonight, I'd like to say a heartfelt thank you, and back to you in the studio.